Well, power has been restored to Ukraine's Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The International Atomic Energy Association says Ukraine confirmed the plant was back on the electricity grid after a power line had been damaged yet again by Russian forces occupying the plant. There have been concerns over the risk of a radiation leak if the power line had not been repaired. Well, Tom Scott is Professor in Nuclear Materials at the University of Bristol.
Well, we really shouldn't be too worried. The main issue around the power outages is that would possibly affect some of the safety monitoring systems that they have on the site. But I know that there's been a lot of worry about potential for fuel overheating. I can clearly sort of state that this fuel is over 2 decades old. It's not producing enough heat to be of any concern.
And what about in terms of radioactivity? I'm just wondering how dangerous power cuts at nuclear plants like this really are.
Well, remember, Chernobyl's not been an operating plant for several decades, and so the fuel that it has on site has had a long time to physically cool down and for the radioactivity from that fuel to drop away. And in fact, before the invasion, they had started to transfer fuel out of the cooling pools that they have there and to put them into dry storage. And in dry storage, the fuel elements, the fuel rods, are just cooled by air, and that's because they're not producing enough heat that they could sort of get a sort of out of control self-heating event.
Chernobyl might be out of action, but there are other operational nuclear plants, aren't there? What's the risk to the 3 that are in Ukraine, those nuclear power stations?
Well, we've had Zaporizhzhia has already been taken by Russian forces. There was some damage to that site, but luckily none of the reactor buildings were hit substantially. But of course, there's a chance with these other 3 sites, which are still in Ukrainian territory and haven't yet been contested, that any ground fighting inadvertently may cause some collateral damage, which could be dangerous for those sites. But the good news is that the types of nuclear reactor that they're using, these VVER reactors, are a completely different type of reactor than the Chernobyl reactors. So it wouldn't be possible for a Chernobyl extent event to occur.
If the worst does happen, though, on those other sites, what are we looking at then?
Well, probably the worst that you would be looking at is what we call a loss of coolant incident. Something similar in a way to what happened at Fukushima. That would be a sort of quite extreme worst case scenario. I would underline that it's quite unlikely for that to happen. And that's because the pressure vessel and the bioshield which surrounds the reactor core are very substantial civil structures, which would be very, very robust to any sort of external kinetic perturbations from the outside. These reactors are built like fortresses, mainly to block the radiation coming from the reactor core, but inversely it has the beneficial effect of protecting the reactor core from the outside as well.
You talk about those safety measures already in place and those, I suppose, old Soviet pieces of infrastructure that are pretty robust. In terms of extra protection, what measures could be put in place?
Well, there's obviously a strong sort of lobby and attempted dialogues with both the Ukrainians and the Russians from the IAEA to urge them not to contest these power station sites. If at all, we should be trying to ensure that there is no fighting around these sites. And ideally, if fighting comes into the nearby area, that these reactors should be shut off so that any sort of risk to the power plant is reduced by the fact that the reactors are offline.